Hi, I'm Freddy Sheed. I'm currently in Belfast playing with Lewis Capaldi, but I do occasional session work with other people as well. I'm 25 now. I've been playing drums since I was 3. Kind of the pots and pans philosophy of your parents getting a bit pissed off, and then you kind of move on. And my dad got me a drum kit which sat in our garage, and I grew up on like the south coast. So yeah, it's definitely been quite a while, but it's always been on and off. I started taking it very seriously when I was like 14. I was very lucky enough that my dad, for my 6th birthday, gave me a studio session that was just like kind of a treat. I mean, I didn't have that kind of... It was really interesting doing a studio session at that age when, I don't know if you like when, as soon as the camera goes on, like when I was trying to talk to the camera, but you get that red light syndrome. But when you're 6 years old, you don't have any awkwardness whatsoever. So my first experience of being in a studio was when I was 6, and I also went in there like a total psychopath, because I wasn't nervous whatsoever. It was like completely connected with joy. So yeah, that was definitely like definitely like triggered something in me, especially the love of the studio thing. And then kind of started properly studying when I was 18. So I left school at this point, and that's when I went and studied with a teacher called Bob Armstrong, who you may or may not have heard of. He was kind of like the leading drum educator, based out of London, but taught some greats. He taught Ash and Ralph and Ian Thomas, and yeah, pretty big lessons from him. And that was kind of had to rebuild a lot of my architecture just over the years of not really playing with any technique, but that's when I first remembered needing to develop my tools on like a deep level. Up to then it was very joy-based. I knew that's what I wanted to do for my career, but it was always, I'm just going to play, I'm going to do things that are fun. Whereas like my teacher Bob would have me, I think we spent like 4 or 5 months just playing quarter note on a ride cymbal at like 50 beats per minute. And before he even let me strike the cymbal, it was working out how to lift the stick correctly, and at what point in the beat do you lift the stick. So yeah, that's when things kind of fell into the rabbit hole. First few lessons were really tough. My dad would like take the day off work, get me up, like drive me up to Essex. It was like the first 2 times or whatever, and that was, we were living in Portsmouth, so that was a good like 2 or 3 hours up there at that time of the day. And my lesson was at 10, I think, 10 a.m. And Bob was very strict. He was like, if you're late, don't bother. If you don't do your homework, don't bother coming back. And he really like went in for the first few times. And I remember that drive home from the first lesson with Bob, I was very quiet. But you had to really like give yourself to him, and he would then give you the results back. But it was intense, but some of the best lessons I've ever had in my life, like little things too, like he was great on like the really deep longitudinal practice and like the stuff that will last you, ages, but he's also like gave you the occasional kind of like tip with stuff that would just totally blow your mind, Like, I remember him showing me like the pitch of a drumstick and the sound of like 2 identical drumsticks, but one being a higher pitch, and then playing that on a ride cymbal, and hearing that it was like the cymbal had gone HD. It's like there's so many more satisfying frequencies coming out of the cymbal at a higher pitched stick. I remember being in a drum shop on one of my first tours. I remember being in a drum shop in like Madrid or something, and Bob would get you to listen to the drumstick, and I took the stick out from the little holder they had in the shop and did this, and some other guy in the shop went, hang on a minute, Bob Armstrong, and I was like, that's mental, but you know, like little things like that, he was really fabulous with, yeah. The first tune I ever remember learning was, I think it was a Foo Fighters tune, I think it was Learn to Fly. But yeah, it was always, I grew up listening with loads of music, you know, my father was a big prog guy, and my mom more into her soul, to James Brown. We had this like Blues and Soul Masters record that stayed in the car on the way to school and shit like that. So kind of, yeah, my dad was sort of more jazz and prog and classical and stuff, and my mum was, yeah, just more kind of feel, like lots of soul music and stuff like that. But I was always encouraged to just play. Like the CD, which I need to dig up from the studio session when I was 6, was just total improvising. It was my dad, because my dad's a Hammond player, piano player. So the recording is just him and me improvising. And I've definitely need to find the CD. I've been looking for it ever since. But yeah, I remember it being, yeah, it always encouraged to kind of improvise over sort of playing arrangement of any sort. Felt a bit too schooly, the whole remembering arrangements at that age. I mean, I was obsessed with drums and I knew like all of my favourite players by that point, but that's when I really didn't just sit at a kit and play, you know, that was when I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to practice this stuff. I think I was 17 or 18. 18. It was shortly after starting with Bob. And I was working with this singer-songwriter called Gabriel Bruce. And kind of not really, so my dad, I had a place to live with my dad, but I was up in London a bunch and I was trying to kind of do that. So I was staying on sofas and shit like that, and started working with Gabe, and he's like the best way to describe him would be like a disco Leonard Cohen, or at least at that time.
Okay.
And like at that time of his career, he was making music that was like super moody, incredible beats and drums and stuff. And it was just me, a keyboard player, some tracks, and 2 singers, because originally it was like just him and the 2 singers and track, and it was like this kind of disco karaoke vibe, but he was such an amazing performer. So it was kind of my first tour, and Gabe kind of introduced me to, you know, like Queens of the Stone Age on a bit of a deeper level and stuff like that, and he was really good. Still maybe one of the hardest playing gigs I've ever worked on at that time. Like he has a way of pushing you to a whole different level playing wise, which was really cool. It was like like a lot of the record bits were programmed, so it was learning how to play some of these beats that he's invented, which was difficult. It was super hard hitting, which was new for me, coming from like, I mean, I've grown up on a diet predominantly of Steve Gadd. He's like, we'll get to that in a bit, but so that was new for me. And it was like, you know, we didn't have like a monitor guy and stuff, we were in a van, so it was very much like click in one ear, wedge, spitting audio back at you through the other, and just like fucking going for it, you know. Thoroughly enjoyable, but like such a great first tour to have. Mr. Gadd is always going to be like that, and it's just something I can rely on. That's kind of my zero, with, you know, his touch and his playing is absolutely next level, still on point. Yeah, I also like, the thing I've always loved about Steve's playing is he has obviously a very recognisable vocabulary, but he's this super versatile guy. People know him as like, he went from Paul Simon to then, you know, Clapton, or then often then did some records with Chick Corea, and like there's that whole world of him being a super versatile guy, but he's managed to imprint his identity across the genres. Yeah. Like I can really turn the radio on and tell if it's him. Even by like just his hi-hat touch or whatever. Yeah. Like a really peculiar type sounding hi-hat. Like, I don't know, I'm a huge fan of his hi-hat playing. I think it might be something to do with his marching background. Because I think always when you're like digging into some of your heroes, there's like a first territory listening level and a second. And if you learn verbatim what, let's say you're into Keith Carlock, and you listen to like a straight up, like one level, like learn Keith Carlock's sound, then you'll only be sort of one that, like, I think the hack is to actually listen to what Keith Carlock was listening to. So you learn the tools as opposed to the verbatim kind of notes. So Carlock studied with Ed Soph, who's like a very deep drum tutor. So kind of start there and go back. But with Gad, I think because he played a load of military bands, did a load of marching, and that is like such different, I can't even imagine how that scene would work. But there's a certain thing you can hear about in players, I think, that have gone through the marching band. Like, I don't know if you hear it, but like even their hi-hat, obviously rudiment-wise and snare touch is a big one, but even hi-hats, like the way that someone that's come from marching band plays eighth notes is like instantly recognisable. Juliana, Carlock, Gad, like they're all in that. Like there's some way they negotiate time on a hi-hat that's just can only come from having to do it with loads of people at the same time, you know?
Yeah.
Or like listening to it as a, like, instead of it being your one note, like listening like it's a well-voiced chord, you know, you've got so many elements going on at the same time, sounding good as one, I think. And that distills into your playing, you know, like your balance. But Gad has all of that for me. Brian Blade as well is just like my ultimate as well. Like I adore his playing, I adore his kind of his career, his discography. I don't know, I think instead of like go on some like deep territory as to why, I prefer to recommend some listening, because Brian's playing on like Joshua Redman's record, kind of, there's a record called, I mean this is like quite easy to find, a tune called Jazz Crimes, that's Brian and Josh, which is like just phenomenal, great solo in it. But yeah, just like if you kind of follow the family tree almost of the records he's played on, you'll just be astounded. I've been loving John Theodore. These aren't like my top 5 at this point. Like I adore John Theodore. I think he's just the epitome of a sound, or just like an energy. Like I really love that. I know Cy was talking about Joe Clegg, and Joe's like, there's just a certain energy with his touch. It's the same with John Theodore. It's like, it's just a thing, you know, it's instantly like, it's like being hit in the face with like a train or something listening to John Theodore. I mean, it's mental. But, and the guy starts hitting even harder as the night goes on, which I adore. So a few years ago, I went to see Queens of the Stone Age because their audio crew at the time were our old crew from a few tours ago, and I sat at the front of the house and just watching Theodore's sound. I think like hitting hard and sounding great are actually quite difficult things to do. Like I think you can work on hitting really hard, but you lose a lot of that tone, I think, when you're like wellying a kit. But something about John Theodore, he can hit really, really hard, and it's not unpleasant to listen to. Keith Carlock, actually, who I've sat as close as we are right now in a club and listened to him play with like those kind of bright Zildjian cymbals and open toms and stuff, and hitting fucking hard, but it doesn't hurt your ears at all. Like it's warm and wide and stuff. It's really nice. I think there's just these guys that work that have just kind of spanned a while and worked on different things, but there's just a sound there, you know. Like there's something about the players that I mentioned, their sound. I think music and especially drum playing comes down to time and sound over anything else. Yeah. Like if you have those two things, you're solid, you're golden. Yeah. I met my girlfriend playing in a John Mayer trio covers band. Okay. We've been together for 10 years. That was at school. Nice. That was pretty fun. The lead up to it and then playing in our school band was pretty awesome, because it was like shredding guitar solos and getting to be Steve Jordan, and also really fancying this girl that I later got together with. I've had some cool experiences professionally as well. Like, I don't know, I think, so I worked a little bit a few years ago with a band called the 1975, and there were some issues with their usual guy, like he broke his collarbone, ended up having to fill in for a little while. And the first show I did with those guys, the feeling as it was coming to a close, well, when it closed, like that first, I learned the gig in like 10 hours or something, because just based on a lot of boring stuff that I won't bore you with, but that was like a particularly good gig. It was in Tulsa, and it was in this kind of small arena, I'd say, but insane concentration levels. Like that's kind of been the best for like playing wise, and I was really happy with the performance of that as well. I played for a few years with a band called the Japanese House, and we, like the last tour I did with her, the album had come out, and we did a show in Edinburgh in a venue called The Caves that was very, like it was like this crazy bricked, quite small venue, really intimate, but there was something about the feeling of it not, because I knew I was kind of moving on after that show, so the feeling of it not being forever, and it was the first day that I'd really started savouring the notes, you know, because like this might be the second or third to last time I ever get to play these. Like that was quite heavy. I remember just enjoying every minute of that show too. One of the best musical experiences I've ever had in my whole life has been out in that studio with, it was just Amber, the artist, BJ, the producer, and me, and a few other guys, but they weren't involved in what we were doing. The studio's in this house, and it's got like two rooms. It's like A and B, and the beds are above the live room. And it was just like winter time in Wisconsin, like snow, like nothing nearby, and just like laser focus. And also I was booked for 2 weeks, so the first week was like tracking the onions and garlic of the records, you know, the big live kit takes, and then the second week we moved to the other studio, which was more modular synths and like a vocal booth. So we put like small kick snare hat in a vocal booth, and then made like our weird effects kit, and then sent it through a load of modular gear and stuff like that. But it was just so creative. Mm-hmm. I remember just being like, this is the happiest I've been in so long. So maybe even over a gig, so that might be one of the big pinnacles for me. That show, that thing I did with Sai, which I think he spoke about briefly on the podcast before, about we improvised in a spaceship on the roof of Central St Martin's in London, just like early January, just duo, to no audience, just a camera in the middle that was 360, and did a live stream to a venue elsewhere for people to watch. It was a venue in America actually, so we were on at like 2 in the morning or something, and like Si and I just agreed nothing beforehand other than these are the, like he had some modular bits. We had no plan of what we were going to do other than we wanted to do some kind of like cosmic, like going to the moon thing, so Si sampled a little speech at the top and then sort of manipulated the audio, and then we just span off. There was no concept of tempo or key, or we just went off. And I remember, and we had to do it, we had to play for like an hour, which was like, by the end of it, it was very cathartic, like when to actually call the stop point. So yeah, that I always remember that gig as well. Any opportunity to play with Simon Francis, I would pay to do, if anything, like his. That was particularly fun, that gig. I'll remember that one for a while. I'm trying to think about things that I've done. I remember being on quite an early tour. It was like a pop tour, my first ever pop tour. That I did, and I remember there was like this one track that was off click, and it was like the tempo was quite quick, and then it broke down to like, it had like a breakdown of 8 bars into this, which is like where the guitar solo happened, and then it span out. I mean, pretty out there pop gig, but fun. And you come down and landmark the one, like a snare on the one, and then you're just kind of ticking away with 2 and 4 on the bass drums. It's like a kind of, little break. And it was 8 bars of that, and I just absolutely lost all concept of where like the phrase was, and it was just melting. I was so embarrassed. I was gutted, and it was funny watching the band that were also really experienced, great players turn around and just like try and decipher what on earth I was doing. So yeah, it was an early pop gig. It was in Denmark, and it was quite a dark experience all around. And then for the rest of that tour, I'd have to count in my head the amount of bars, even though I knew where the time was, I knew where it was, but because it had freaked me out so much, I counted. I kept going. I think I must have played like 7-bar phrase or something, like instead of 8, but it really wigged me out. My advice with that whole world would be look at it with music in the best interest. Because all the best guys that do that, like Clegg, who's phenomenal, he's music first, everything that he does, his music is top priority first, every time. And for me, it's just an extension. It's just like having another tom or a snare there or something. And less of it is great also. Like we've had the treat on Lewis of, we've got like these comms mics, so I'll talk and sound check and constantly refining the tones and sounds of the gig from a house. And I'd be like, hey, does this trigger do much for you? It's like, for me, I just prefer the sound of the snare. And we're like, cool, let's just try it for this tune. And you just mute it. And everyone's like, fuck, no, there's space in the song again. It's like, great, cool, let's sack that. So if anything, when we started creating Lewis's live show, everything had sample, everything was really like thick. Electronically. But for drums now, we really like pulling it back and just caring about the source. And then if it's really needed, there's a couple of tunes where I still use the snare trigger, but if it's like a hand clap, I'll have it on a pad. Istanbul, I got like an amazing clap stack thing, which is great, which we tried out a bit too. But I think only when the music requires it. Yeah, I think it's something to do with the simplicity of it, and it does. Well, it sparks joy, is what I said. Like I think it's very. Yeah, it's a very effortless amount of tasks required to spark joy, like with other instruments, quite a lot of other instruments, there's like a certain series of steps you need to do to even kind of get a sound out of it, where I think the kind of tactile element, it's just like beautifully simple. You're just hitting something. I think that appealed to me as a child and sparked joy because it was like an instant way of expressing myself without the kind of like steps beforehand to, of course I had to like relearn a lot of how to play when I got into it, but I think initially it's just that thing where the simplicity of it's so beautiful and like so physical. I think that's why I enjoy it so much, and I think that's why I've selected it as my like main instrument. I was saying I was going to look at, despite getting roasted for it by all of my friends, I was going to look into playing clarinet, only because it's like, before you even, first it's like a laser focus wave going into linear melody, you know, and I think that would strengthen my drum playing. You know, I was talking about those drummers that have another instrument, but I think, yeah, before you even go into that, you need to work out how to make a sound that doesn't, like make a sound, but get a sound out of it. And that's like a whole practice in itself. So now later on, that's sort of very much appealing to me because it's like a real study. But yeah, you can't beat the simplicity and joy of striking a drum with a stick. It's just like such a treat. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's probably why I selected it. I had the advantage of being good at that instrument. Like at least I got good at playing it, or at least I thought I got good at playing it quite early on. So that was useful. It's like, well, I can do this. So that must have played into it a bit as well. But yeah, I think the short and simple answer would be it's tactile and beautiful and just effortlessly simple, you know. I'm looking forward to going to Asia and touring that. I've never done that before. And that's happening in January. Yeah, January. I don't know. Anything, like any events coming up, it's a tough one. I mean, I'm out touring with Lewis for the foreseeable. So I'd recommend getting down to a show if you fancied it. He's great and worth seeing. He's such a good singer and performer. For me personally though, I'm currently doing this and I'm trying to, when I'm not doing this, focus on my personal life. Like I just kind of selected working with Lewis because I knew when I could kind of clock off when we're not on tour and just rely on this for my kind of survival nature. I mean, naturally when I get home, I'm going to be hankering to record and play and do that and like use up the gaps, but also this is like the first time in my life I've been able to, even though I'm really busy on tour, kind of prioritize my home life a bit more, which in turn is making me really, really happy. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not doing any drum clinics or anything. I've done one of those before, kind of a bit weird. Don't know how I felt that. I mean, it was fun, but I've probably, I don't know if it's my thing. Like, I just like playing songs. Yeah, that's a really tough one. I'd come see some Lewis bits, and I'd also, if I'm ever in your town and you're a drummer or a musician and you'd like to drink a coffee, I love drinking coffee. So, and I love meeting new people. So maybe look at the tour dates, and if we're rolling through a town that's anywhere close to where the listeners are, just feel free to send me a message on Instagram or whatever, and we'll do this.